Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. The U.S. Secretary of State, the head of Homeland Security, they are in Mexico City after first the pledge on the campaign trail by Donald Trump to build a wall, and now guidelines that offer sweeping powers to target 11 million undocumented workers in the United States. With us to talk about it from Mexico City, Esteban Yades, journalist at Nexos Magazine. Welcome back as well to Pedro de Costa, who is senior correspondent for Business Insider, as well as Raul Hinojosa Ojeda, director of UCLA's North American Integration and Development Center, and from Los Angeles, James Lacey, attorney and author of Taxifornia. We were talking before the break about remittances, the money that Mexicans send back to Mexico, and how that could be impacted by a deterioration of relationships. Another point of friction has been the Trump administration's order of a review of the aid given to Mexico by the United States. It totals $2.6 billion. It's mostly for security under what's called the Merida Initiative, most notably cracking down on the drug cartels. James Lacey, that review, do you think that the United States should be reeling back its aid to Mexico?
Yes, I do. But I think it should only be temporary. But let me clarify one point, if I can. Earlier, we were talking about crime. It's the 11 million illegal aliens in the United States clearly are illegal and are subject to civil penalties. But they can be subject to criminal penalties, for example, by avoiding going to hearings involving their visas. And if half of them, as someone said earlier, on the show, are a violation of their visas, they can also be subject to separate criminal penalties. Now, as far as the aid is concerned, look, the United States needs to get some help from Mexico.
Are these really the bad hombres you're talking about, Jim? Or are these families and hardworking people?
The bad hombres do include people like the shooter who killed Kate Steinle in San Francisco in 2015, a person who had been deported five times to Mexico.
That's a lone example that you keep citing. That's a lone example that you keep citing that has no statistical relevance whatsoever. So keep talking about it, but it absolutely is irrelevant to the discussion.
Look, last week, a Whittier police officer was shot dead by a criminal Mexican gang member.
Again, let's not talk about, can we talk about the issue, please? Let's just talk about the issue.
So we know that there is a problem in the United States. It's part of the reason why Donald Trump is the president today. The people responded to him. And according to a Harvard poll, 73% of Americans want the Democrats in the United States Congress to work with Donald Trump to solve these problems. But coming back to your question, Mexico accounts 80% of Mexican exports are to the United States. Mexico's absolutely dependent upon the United States. And I believe because of that fiscal relationship, that business relationship, the United States deserves to have more support from Mexico about this porous border that's bringing in sex trafficking, that's bringing in young prostitutes, including little girls and little boys in large numbers, that's bringing in sex trafficking, and that's bringing in drugs and criminal gangs. And I think that we will get to a point where we can work this out, and it's great.
What do you mean more support? We have DEA agents.
One at a time. Esteban Yades first.
Well, I mean, what more support do you want? We have DEA agents working for years here in Mexico, ATF agents. I mean, we've been working to stop Central American immigration for years now under Barack Obama, now under Donald Trump. So I'm not sure what more support Mr. Lear wants when Mexico is actually helping the United States fight undocumented immigration.
And what's the consequences, Esteban, going to be for Mexico's southern border? The Homeland Security boss who's just come from Guatemala before this trip to Mexico City.
I mean, we're definitely going to get more immigrants here in the southern border now. I mean, well, we are getting more immigrants from Central America, not from Mexico. That's an important point. I mean, more immigrants from Central America rather than Mexico are crossing into the United States. But Mexico is tightening security. I mean, we have gotten aid, as Mr. Leary has said, from the United States, especially the Merida Initiative, which has helped fight drug trafficking here in Mexico. But I would have to argue that drug trafficking here in Mexico has increased because consumption in the United States of drugs has increased. So the problems here in Mexico really do have to do with drug habits in the United States.
On this point, Pedro da Costa, let me ask you at this point in time, when you look at the overall situation of the movement of people, is it the end of NAFTA, what we're seeing right now?
It certainly seems like we're headed toward its unraveling, but it's a long-standing agreement that has many components, and when you actually dig into the ways in which the Trump administration might, quote-unquote, renegotiate NAFTA, Treasury Secretary Mnuchin has actually referred to many of the provisions that were included in the very Trans-Pacific Partnership that Trump rejected. So it's really difficult to know what you're going to end up with, but it's certainly the deepest strain in U.S.-Mexican relations that we've seen probably in the last 80 years. And again, earlier it was said that there's no upside, and I agree with that almost completely. The upside is to get the base, including James Lacey out in California and his minions, riled up, and people talking about Mexicans being the problem with the economy, and that's really the message. That's what Donald Trump is trying to do.
Let's talk about that.
That's how he got elected.
Pedro, let's talk about that.
That's called, populism. Yep, go ahead.
When he visited the border on horseback, the Republican Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives getting a mixed reception. Paul Ryan met by hecklers as he and other congressmen followed the Rio Grande in McAllen, Texas on Wednesday. Not everyone, though, is protesting. Danish television spoke to pecan farmers at the border in Arizona. There's no Rio Grande there, just a dried up riverbed.
We have a counterpuncher for the first time in many years. So I think his style, while it can be abrasive to those that don't know him, at the end of the day, when I go to sleep at night, I feel that we have a patriot running the country.
I think any country has a right to defend itself from an invasion that possibly is going to change its culture.
Raul Hinojosa Ojeda, let me ask you, when you look at the border area, it's polarized. Not everybody is against Donald Trump. There are people who support him on this.
Well, it's very interesting. At UCLA, we did a study of where the Trump voters are throughout the United States. And what we find is that 98% of the counties that voted for Donald Trump have never seen a Mexican. They have nothing to do with Mexican immigration.
But he carried states like Arizona.
Excuse me, let me just finish.
Sure.
So the vast majority of his support throughout the United States does not have trade, even importation competition from Mexico. The irony is, in this parts of the Southwest, where Donald Trump does have support, are exactly the counties that depend most on Mexican labor. And we're also analyzing now what would be the impact of massive deportations from the United States. And it would specifically hurt places like California, like Arizona, throughout the United States. This would create the worst economic crisis, much more stronger than the Great Depression, $2.6 trillion if you actually enforced the laws and deported everybody who is in the United States without a proper documentation. That is not the real serious problem, disconnect here, is that there is an actual solution between the United States and Mexico that does have a dramatic upside. And that is moving towards a comprehensive immigration reform that would legalize the immigrants who are already in the United States, allow them to pay taxes. This produces $1.5 trillion in economic benefit. This is the way that you deal with things in a positive way. All of these things, all of these immigration benefits and negative impacts, by the way, outswamp anything you can do in terms of talking about trade.
All right, so but before I get just a second, before I get the panel to respond to your suggestion about immigration reform, let me just ask you, Raul, what do your studies show in terms of why these people, if it's against their economic interest, voted for Donald Trump in those areas near the border?
Well, number one, it's not for economic reasons. There is, in fact, a brilliant lie, because it's a massive lie, that the economic problems throughout the declining sectors and counties of the United States is related to Mexico. They're not. It's not related to Mexico. It has to do with many other issues. But Donald Trump has picked up a script from many old movies to scapegoat somebody and scapegoat the weakest and racially differentiated elements of the population. So what's actually interesting of what's going on now is an incredible reassertion of coalitions of business people, many Republicans who are now really seeing in alliance with immigrants and Democrats, as well as across the border, with a new sense of a need to restore sanity in objection to this completely false narrative that is only going to drive a wedge and really distract the United States from a much more serious set of issues around the world. Mexico used to be seen as a security threat. The CIA used to have it as a security threat in the 1980s. Ronald Reagan did something very interesting. He actually moved through comprehensive immigration reform and significantly reduced the negative conflicts between Mexico and the United States. And in fact, with NAFTA, significantly created mass benefits on both sides of the border. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't better ways to improve on all of those, but what's going on here is throwing out generations of attempts for cooperation for no reason except a political attachment to a racist lie that did help him get elected, but basically will have no benefit to his people. And in fact, they will all be hurt, as our studies are now showing, much more if we continue down this path of a trade war and mass deportations. There is no upside here. This will be the undoing of Donald Trump's presidency, as well as a creation of a coalition against this type of silliness that I think will carry the day in the end.
James Lacey, do you agree that immigration reform is perhaps an issue where there could be even consensus?
Well, you know, look, what we've just heard are some really wild assertions. I mean, the notion that 98% of the counties that voted for Donald Trump have never seen a Mexican is just completely absurd. Now, I have three or four points I want to make quickly. First of all, I worked in the Reagan administration when the Simpson-Mazzoli comprehensive reform was passed. That was 30 years ago. That's what your speaker is referring to, and it's a failure. The reason it's a failure is because we've got 11 million illegal aliens in the United States today. It's not just an economic problem, it's a crime problem. Now, I want to talk about rhetoric very quickly. The wall. You want to say that Donald Trump is a racist because he supports the wall. Yet 80 members of the United States Senate passed the Secure Border Fence Act of 2006, which is essentially the law that Donald Trump is using to build the wall. 80 senators, including Dianne Feinstein, one of the most liberal Democratic senators in the United States. The point is that there is a concerted effort to slander Donald Trump on the issue that we have before us, which is the problem of the porous border with Mexico. And if we call it a fence and we make it 2006 and we have George W. Bush involved with it, it's okay. Democrats can support it, but because Donald Trump made it a campaign issue, they won't support it.
We have spent over $250 billion on border security since Ronald Reagan. And you're right about comprehensive immigration reform. What was not in there was to take into effect the need of labor in the United States. These workers are coming across the border and have historically come across completely on the basis of the unemployment rate of the United States. When the unemployment in the United States goes down, that's when immigration picks up. When there's unemployment in the United States, they return back. And this has been a hugely beneficial issue for the United States.
Legally. They
Fine.
can come in
Let's
legally.
create a
There's
legal
a process
system.
for them to come
Let's
in legally.
create a legal system.
My final point. I don't mind paying 40 cents a pound more for my asparagus in California to understand that that's helping to create a more secure border, and it's helping to create more legality in our immigration system, because that's the effect. That's the only effect. It's a minor effect.
No.
To have better laws.
We made a movie. We made a movie called A Day Without a Mexican. You can go get it at Netflix. That was a joke compared to the reality of what will happen. The reality of what would happen would be a devastation, especially to California, that 80% of the agriculture, the #1 agricultural state in the United States, would be in complete jeopardy, and it wouldn't be 40 cents more. You would not have food.
All those workers need to do is apply to be here legally. That's all they need to do.
We don't have a system for that. That's what Donald Reagan.
All right. Let me bring in on this Estebanillades. The idea that create the frame where there can be more legal employment, especially for menial jobs like agricultural work. What are the thoughts in Mexico on this?
Well, I mean, we would definitely like to work on that. I mean, to get an actual legal frame. But I mean, we tried to work on comprehensive immigration reform in the late 1990s, in the early 2000s. Mexican government was working with President Bush at the time. Then September 11 came around, and the whole immigration reform was shoved away. I mean, there's Mexicans going to the United States because I'm sorry to say it, but there's jobs that the United States people in the United States don't want to do. I mean, picking berries, picking strawberries, whatever you want, menial jobs as you describe them. I mean, Mexicans are going over there because they're willing to do that job, because Americans are not willing to do that. I mean, so that's one of the main reasons we're going over there. So we would definitely welcome some sort of legal apparatus to make people legal. But when you have President Trump, when you have ICE chasing people who have done nothing wrong. I mean, families, children who were brought in by their parents, who they didn't choose to go to the United States. They were brought by their parents. And now they're being treated as criminals when they didn't have any decision in that process. I mean, so they're not giving us enough room to actually work or try to negotiate this legal apparatus that you speak of, because they don't want us there.
All right, I want to bring up a point that you made at the outset, Esteban, which was whether or not Rex Tillerson really has President Trump's ear. 1 month in, daily foreign policy briefings to the press are still on hold. Tillerson's been left out of important phone calls to foreign ambassadors and seemingly important assignments. Trump's son-in-law put in charge of Middle East peace brokering outside of any State Department tutelage. Pedro da Costa, let me ask you, what do you make of Rex Tillerson's role at this point in time?
Oh, you know, I'm not going to be the first person to say that this is a White House in chaos, a White House that has yet to fill out a lot of the, important body of staff in many of the departments. And so it's really a hollow government where people don't know who's in charge. And as you know, recently mixed messages were sent between Bannon and Pence to Europe. And so it's hard to know, but I think Donald Trump, is his own man, and I feel like, we should listen to him when it comes to policy and not any of his surrogates.
Tillerson speaking in the company of his Mexican counterpart, saying, "We seized the opportunity to strengthen trade and the energy relationship." Of course, Pedro, he's the former boss of Exxon. Back in December, Exxon, one of 8 oil majors that were awarded blocks in the Gulf of Mexico. Do Do you have a doubt over whether or not he's still working for Exxon?
I mean, it's not for me to have a doubt or not, but I think the very appearance of conflict, and I've written about this in the past, the conflict of interest doesn't necessarily mean that somebody actually acts in the worst interest of the public just because they had associations with the private sector. But the very impression of corruptibility, I think, is damaging to American institutions. And you see that not just at the State Department, but with Trump himself and his refusal to fully divest himself of his assets, his seeming willingness to negotiate issues related to the Trump organization as president, his mixing of business and pleasure, if you will, in a way that is really unprecedented in the U.S. presidency.
James Lacey, how much clout does Rex Tillerson have?
Well, he has tremendous clout. I mean, the United States is very lucky to have someone as accomplished as him. You know, to be the head of Exxon, a huge corporation, to do so successfully and to do so without scandal. You know, many people don't realize that a company like Exxon is subject to Security and Exchange Commission rules. There are many disclosures that company has to make, and there are many personal disclosures that Rex Tillerson has to make. Under the Office of Government Ethics, to become the Secretary of State, Tillerson had to disclose page after page after page of his own financial dealings. He had to fill out, you know, a 50 or a 60-page form that disclosed information to the Senate committee.
That's on the ethics portion. We're running short on time, so let me just ask you, on the issue of having clout, I mean, we get the sense that when you're the U.S. Secretary of State, you're one tweet away from Trump of being undermined by whatever you talk about with the Mexican foreign minister.
Yeah, and he's in line for the presidency as well, but this is a substantive person who's dealt with world leaders, you know, across the globe, and he's going to do a good job for us. And I think eventually you'll see good things coming out of this Mexico relationship.
Raul Hinojosa Ojeda?
Well, again, I think if this is an example of an intelligent art of the deal, we have yet to see any results of this. On the contrary, I think what's happening is that you've placed your negotiators 100 yards back from the starting line by doing what Donald Trump has done. He is making it almost impossible for the Mexican leadership to have any constructive relationships with somebody like Rex Tillerson on issues that might be of beneficial impact on both sides, unless he gives up some of his most fundamental issues, like the insistence on this wall and the paying of the wall, which is completely immaterial to creating a positive relationship between the two countries. So I don't expect, unfortunately, much to come from a cleaning up of the mess that has been created for quite a while. In fact, I think the most likely outcome now is going to be a radicalization and a polarization of Mexican politics, where in fact we're already seeing the growth of the ironic possibility of a radical populist in Mexico emerging now as a direct result of Donald Trump, and then we'll really start to have security problems on the border. Same thing with Central America. Central America is in a very, very precarious situation, coming out of a civil war that's taken quite a while to try to recover from that. The United States could easily plunge that region back into war, and I think Kelly, who's speaking right now, could be. I think would recognize the need to move towards a development-based solution.
I want to thank you. Unfortunately, we're running short on time. I want to thank you for joining us from Washington. I want to thank as well Pedro da Costa, James Lacey in Los Angeles, and Esteban Illades in Mexico City. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Creedon. Yeah, the panel's second guessing over whether or not Rex Tillerson has the ear of the new U.S. president.
Well, a lot of headlines are pointing out how he has taken a backstage role, I guess, or he certainly vis-a-vis previous secretaries of state, a lot less visible, a lot less prominent than his predecessors. In his first month of the Trump presidency, the State Department has been sidelined. That's the analysis of the Washington Post, saying that decisions on hiring and policy and scheduling are being driven by the White House. The most visible change at the State Department is the month-long lack of a daily press briefing, which has been a fixture since the 1950s. Over at CBS, they are calling Rex Tillerson the silent man at the State Department. Some of America's past top diplomats have practiced sort of discreet diplomacy. Apparently, Madeleine Albright, according to this piece, famously said diplomatic talks, like mushrooms, grow best in the dark. But I think there's something else going on here. It's not just a case of discreet diplomacy. Tillerson seems to be taking this idea to new extremes, says CBS. Meanwhile, Politico say that he is already underwater. They talk about the incredible shrinking State Department. So really there is a kind of a consensus that the White House has sort of relegated the State Department to second place when it comes to taking the forefront in foreign policy. Just a quick look at some headlines vis-a-vis this trip to Mexico. It was intended to soothe tensions. Even Donald Trump admitted that it was going to be a tough trip. Just one or two slightly maybe humorous tweets. Some people were annoyed, in fact, that the Mexican press seemed to come out with this information about this trip ahead of the US press. So there you go. Some even saying, should Rex Tillerson be deported by the Department of Homeland Security to Mexico? I don't think that's exactly how things are going to go.
All right, many thanks for that, James Creedon. Once again, I want to thank our panel. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.